He stood on the deck of the merchant vessel, leaning over the railing with a cup of sour red wine in hand, tasting salt on his lips and the bitter regret at the back of his throat. Tyrion Lannister had spent much of his life convincing others, and sometimes even himself, that he was indifferent to regrets, but he could not stop thinking about the moment in that cramped cabin on another ship, when he decided not to place his trust in Varys, not to sail across the narrow sea in search of the Dragon Queen. He would not serve Daenerys Targaryen. He had chosen a different path, and now the consequences of that choice weighed heavily upon him, though he tried to ignore them behind a scrim of wine. A flock of gulls trailed behind the vessel, calling into the wind, as Tyrion's eyes scanned the horizon. There was a prickling in his chest, an itch that never quite dissipated, urging him to second-guess himself. He could still see in his mind the look on Varys's face, the spider's penetrating gaze, that hint of compassion or pity. Tyrion was never entirely sure which it had been. The memory festered in him as he cradled his wine cup and sought forgetfulness. Yet the decision had been made, and so he had departed King's Landing in secret, slipping through byways and worn roads under the cover of darkness, traveling with merchants and exiled knights, using what remained of his cunning and gold to purchase fleeting safety. Each step away from the Red Keep, he felt the intangible presence of his father's ghost, Tywin Lannister, cold and grim, silently condemning him. Now, with all that behind him and an uncertain future ahead, he could only press forward. He had boarded a ship bound for Volantis first, or so he had planned, but a last-minute rumor about Sellswords needing cunning quartermasters on the stepstones altered his route. In the end, the sails had shifted southward, crossing the summer sea, and Tyrion found himself forging new alliances in unfamiliar ports. That was how he came to be on the Salt Finch, a battered merchant carrack carrying spice, cloth, and a handful of aspiring fortune-seekers. He was not going east to Meereen, nor was he traveling to ally himself with a Targaryen claimant. It was said that Daenerys Targaryen had freed slaves, gathered powerful allies, and was raising armies to reclaim Westeros. But Tyrion had not joined her. Instead, he drifted like flotsam on the waves, uncertain of what he would do next. He remembered the last words exchanged in that cramped room before he parted ways with Varys. Tyrion had refused to listen to promises of destiny and dragons, concluding that no good would come of aligning himself with yet another ruler who might see him only as a useful dwarf to be patronized or exploited. He had not trusted Daenerys, nor did he trust himself to pick the right monarch after his many misjudgments in King's Landing. And so he had left, tired and unmoored, hoping that the open ocean would give him enough distance to breathe and to think without the weight of Lannister expectations. He took another swig of the sour wine, grimaced, and forced the tangy liquid down his throat. It tasted like ashes, although he supposed that had more to do with his mood than the wine's quality, which was barely passable. The ship rolled beneath him, sails rustling in the warm breeze. The gulls lost interest in the vessel when they realized there would be no easy scraps thrown overboard. 2 nights later, land emerged from the haze. Tyrion peered through the twilight and saw rocky outcroppings rising like spines from the sea. The stepstones, that chaotic cluster of islands that was neither fully part of Westeros nor Essos, but somewhere in between, dominated by pirates, Sellswords, and the fluid alliances of petty rulers who claimed dominion for as long as they could hold it. It was a perfect place, Tyrion thought with wry humor, for a man like him. Unloved, hunted by some, needed by few. Here, no one would look twice at a dwarf with a cunning tongue, unless he proved himself too valuable to ignore. He disembarked at a ragged wooden pier, paying the ship's captain with the last of his silver stags and a small ornament he had stolen from his father's solar. The captain gave him a curt nod, uncertain whether this passenger was merely eccentric or truly mad. Tyrion made his way along the pier, weaving around crates and barrels, ignoring the curious stares from sailors and dockworkers. His short legs carried him onto a narrow, muddy street that snaked between ramshackle huts and dilapidated warehouses. The smell was wretched, stale fish, rotting wood, and the stink of sweat mingled in the humid air. He needed a place to lie low, to find out where the Sellsword captains were recruiting, and to ascertain if there was a coin to be made by someone with a knack for strategy and negotiation. After all, he still prided himself on his mind. Let other men fling themselves into battle with sharpened steel and blind courage. Tyrion would bring a sharper wit to the table so long as someone would pay for it. He found a dingy tavern at the end of the street, a faded sign hanging askew above the door. The sign depicted a chipped sword with a droplet of blood on its tip. The boards creaked beneath him as he stepped inside. The heat thickened. The room was close and smelled of cheap ale and overcooked stew. A cluster of unsavory types lingered in a corner, dicing in silence, while a lone minstrel sat by the far wall, strumming half-hearted chords on a battered lute. A woman who appeared to run the place eyed him from behind the bar. She was tall, with broad shoulders and a missing ear. She said nothing, but her gaze followed him. He climbed onto a stool, slapped a few copper coins on the counter, and gestured for ale. The barkeep set down a battered tankard in front of him, half filled with dark liquid. Tyrion sniffed it suspiciously before taking a cautious sip. It was lukewarm and bitter, but not the worst he had tasted. He flicked his eyes around the tavern, listening for scraps of conversation that might hint at local conflicts or opportunities. Over time, he had developed an ear for such things. Where tensions brewed, the cunning could earn a profit. That evening, he learned of a warlord who called himself the Lord of Embers, rumored to be gathering sellswords in an attempt to claim dominion over 3 neighboring islands. The region was perpetually in flux, with self-styled lords rising and falling as quickly as the tide. Pirates and mercenaries abounded. Tyrion wondered if there might be a comfortable place for him in the service of this Lord of Embers, if only until a more profitable contract emerged. Here, there was no scornful father, no siblings to overshadow him, no illusions of grandeur. Just survival, coin, and occasionally a good cup of wine. That would be enough. He took a small, dingy room at the tavern, paying for a night. He lay on a straw-stuffed mattress that smelled faintly of mildew and listened to the distant crash of waves against the rocky shore. His thoughts meandered to the memory of Shay in Tywin's bed, the crossbow in his hands, the shock in his father's eyes as the bolt struck him. Tyrion closed his own eyes against the ghosts. Perhaps it was best that he never faced the Targaryen queen or served in her court. His sins would trail him wherever he went, but at least he needn't worry about betraying or disappointing another ruler. Let others chase dragons. When dawn light crept through the cracks in the shuttered window, he roused himself and strode back into the tavern's common room. A few patrons were already at their cups. The tall barkeep, her hair in a tight braid, was cutting bread behind the counter. Tyrion ordered a heel of bread and a slab of salt fish, washed down with a watery ale. With renewed energy, he stepped back onto the street, determined to locate the sellsword recruiters. He found them in a muddy yard behind a collapsed building where a makeshift training ground had been set up. Men with battered armor sparred with wooden swords while an older officer with a scar running down his cheek barked orders. Tyrion approached, doing his best to avoid the splatter of mud and sweat. A few men cast him sidelong looks, some with curiosity, others with derision. He was used to it. He made his way to the officer and cleared his throat. "I'm here for the same reason as everyone else," Tyrion said, forcing confidence into his tone. "I hear the Lord of Embers is looking for skilled men." The officer sized him up, eyes flicking downward to Tyrion's short stature. "You have a sword hidden somewhere, dwarf? Or do you think we need a court jester?" Tyrion folded his arms. "I bring something far more valuable than a sword arm. I bring a mind. My name is Tyrion, and I can help your Lord of Embers plan campaigns, negotiate alliances, and trick your foes into making grave mistakes. Of course, if he prefers brute strength alone, I'll go elsewhere." There was a moment's pause. Then the officer snorted and asked, "Where's your accent from?" "Westeros." "Yes," Tyrion replied, lifting his chin. "King's Landing, originally." The officer gave him a brusque nod. "We've had Westerosi in the ranks before. Sellswords, mostly. You want to speak to Commander Halvar. He's the one recruiting, not me." He gestured toward a shady overhang where a man in dark leather stood, arms folded, observing the sparring men. Tyrion walked across the yard, careful not to slip on the muddy ground. Commander Halvar was tall and lean with wiry muscles. His hair was cropped short, revealing a network of small scars on his scalp, and his eyes were pale as ice. He studied Tyrion with a calm, measured gaze. "You don't look like much," Halvar said at length. "And yet I've seen men who stand 6 feet tall fail miserably at tasks I accomplish with ease." Tyrion replied dryly. "I'm told you seek cunning as well as brawn. I was master of coin in King's Landing once. I can manage finances, plan supply lines, and ensure your men remain fed and paid. I also have some experience in political maneuvering." Halvar's brows drew together. "Master of coin? That's a grand claim. Prove it." "I have no time for charlatans." Tyrion shrugged. "I'm not expecting you to believe me right away. All I ask is a small chance. Test me however you see fit." Halvar considered, then jerked his head toward a chest propped against the wall. "Inside that chest you'll find ledgers. They detail the squads we have on each island and the pay owed to each. It's a bloody mess. If you can make sense of it, we'll talk further." Tyrion nodded, walked over, and knelt by the chest. The lock was undone, so he lifted the lid. Inside, he found several tattered parchment books, stained and reeking of damp. He pulled one out, wrinkling his nose at the smell, and began leafing through the scrawled entries. They were haphazard, some in a language he recognized, others in a tongue he barely understood. Undeterred, he examined the notation patterns, searching for a system behind them. Time slipped away as he delved into the puzzle. At midday, Halvar returned. Tyrion was surrounded by the ledgers, cross-referencing them in a way that made sense only to him. He looked up with the faintest hint of a triumphant smile. "There's a consistent error in the second ledger," Tyrion said, pointing to a greasy page. "Someone's been skimming pay, listing fewer men than are actually stationed. Whoever wrote this is either lazy or corrupt, or both." Halvar snatched the ledger, scanning the lines. Tyrion continued, "I suspect they've been using the difference for their own pocket. If this is the same scribe who handles your equipment expenditures, you might want to check those as well." He set aside the first ledger and showed Halvar a second. "I've identified at least 3 squads whose pay overlaps. The funds for the Whaler's Watch on one island are also being applied to a squad on another island, despite them apparently being the same men. If you want to keep things stable, you'll need to rectify this. Soldiers know when their pay is mishandled." Halvar's expression flickered with something approaching respect. Could be an honest mistake. Could be theft. He looked Tyrion in the eye. "If it's theft, can you find who's behind it?" Tyrion shrugged. "Given time, yes, though I have no desire to do so for free. Pay me decently. Give me a quiet place to work, and I'll ensure your coffers stop leaking." Halvar studied him a moment longer. "The Lord of Embers doesn't want to hire incompetent fools. This is good work. Go see Mara, the quartermaster, and show her what you found. If she's satisfied, you'll have a place here. You might even get a cot instead of a straw mat." Tyrion bowed his head in mock solemnity. "My thanks." That was how he became the Sellsword Company's bookkeeper. A curious role for the imp, once a Lannister, once suspect in murder, once a fugitive. But it suited him. He had spent enough nights scraping by with the taste of stale wine on his tongue. Now he had the promise of coin, if he played this right. And all it cost him was the willingness to hide behind men with swords and to occasionally lend his strategic mind when asked. It was not a glorious life, but perhaps Tyrion had lost his taste for glory. Survival was enough. And survive he did, week after week, until the Lord of Embers himself arrived to inspect new recruits. He was a broad-shouldered man with a heavy beard that showed streaks of gray. His real name was Jason Pike, rumored to be a former Ironborn who had deserted the Iron Islands in search of better plunder. He had a booming laugh that belied a temper as quick and fierce as wildfire. Tyrion watched him from a distance, trying to gauge what manner of man he served. He was summoned to a small war council one evening, where Jason Pike sat with his most trusted captains. The room was cramped, lit by a single oil lamp that flickered against the rough stone walls. A half-melted candle dripped wax onto a makeshift table. Tyrion stood off to the side, arms folded, taking in every detail. Jason Pike's voice rumbled. "We need to secure trade routes. The pirates have been hitting our supply lines. The last shipment of grain we expected from Myr never arrived." "Halvar, you said you have a plan." Halvar hesitated, glancing at Tyrion. "Actually, I believe our new bookkeeper might have some ideas. He's been studying the ledgers and listening around the tavern." Tyrion, the bearded warlord, turned his attention to the dwarf. Tyrion inclined his head. "I can't speak to how your men handle swords, but I can speak to your finances and what I've overheard. It seems the pirates have a hidden base among the smaller islands to the west. Some call it the Nest of Crows. If you secure that location first, you'll cut off their safe harbor. Then your supply ships can pass more freely." One of the captains scoffed. "Easy to say. That base is well hidden. If we send a fleet, they'll see us coming." Tyrion turned to him. "Which is why you don't send the entire fleet. Send a decoy, something that will draw them out while a smaller, stealthier force lands on the island from the far side. Once you hold the vantage points, you can trap the pirates between two fronts." Jason Pike listened carefully, stroking his beard. "You speak like a man who's seen war councils before, so you propose a trap. We have enough men to split them. We can't be certain until we assess their numbers," Tyrion admitted. "But from what I hear, these pirates aren't a disciplined force. They rely on fear and on the chaos of the Stepstones. A well-coordinated strike will unsettle them. If you seize the Nest of Crows, you could fortify it to guard your shipping lanes." Jason nodded slowly. "We'll discuss the details. For now, you've made a good impression, dwarf. Keep your wits about you." Tyrion bobbed his head and stepped back, letting the discussion continue without him. He felt the old spark of excitement he used to experience in King's Landing when he navigated palace intrigues, albeit on a smaller scale. Here it was simpler: profit, territory, local power. No grand throne to chase. No illusions of saving the realm from war or White Walkers or dragons. As he listened to Jason and his captain's debate, Tyrion wondered if this was how the rest of his life might unfold. Offering counsel to men who craved power, collecting his pay, and moving on when it suited him. It was a modest role, yet it felt oddly liberating. He was beholden to no great house, no queen, no father's ghost. He was just Tyrion, selling his clever mind to whomever was willing to pay. Over the next months, life settled into a routine. He grew accustomed to the Stepstone's rocky inlets and shadowy coves. He spent hours each day poring over supply ledgers, paying sellswords, preventing disputes over wages. He found a small measure of purpose in the work, though late at night, as he sipped wine on the tavern's porch, he would sometimes wonder what was unfolding in Meereen, where a young queen with dragons continued her campaign to free slaves and gather an army. He heard rumors in that dingy tavern of her victories over Yunkai, her skill in forging alliances. Once, he overheard an exiled knight praising her ferocity. Tyrion allowed himself a moment of curiosity. What if he had gone east, truly? But he shook off the thought. That world was not his. Instead, his days were filled with the petty wars of the Stepstones. True to his suggestion, Jason Pike launched a cunning assault on the pirate base, seizing the Nest of Crows after a brief but vicious skirmish. Tyrion's plan to land men on the far side of the island worked, and they trapped the pirates between the water and the attacking force. Those who were not killed or captured fled, leaving the base for Pike's men. Tyrion's role in planning the strategy increased his standing with the warlord, who granted him a modest share of the spoils and even a private corner of a sturdy wooden barracks. Tyrion drank his better wine that night, feeling something akin to pride. Yet each victory had its aftermath. With the pirates scattered, the Stepstones were momentarily calmer, which meant fewer mercenary contracts. Some men drifted away, seeking new conflicts and new coin. Tyrion watched Jason Pike weigh the option of pressing farther into the neighboring isles, trying to carve out a miniature kingdom. Pike's ambition was vast, but the Stepstones were fickle. Rival captains might unite against him if he pushed too far. Eventually, Pike decided to remain on the largest island, the one he'd taken to calling Ember Isle, in honor of his chosen moniker. He established a fortress on the rocky cliffs, employing laborers from nearby islands to fortify the natural caves and build a wooden palisade. Tyrion advised him on matters of supply, treaties with local fishing villages, and even the distribution of loot. In exchange, Tyrion requested only a steady flow of decent wine. Pike obliged, and sometimes Tyrion would join him by the fire, listening to the old Ironborn's tales of raids, storms, and battles at sea. One evening, as the wind howled outside and the surf crashed below the cliff, Tyrion heard the faintest mention of Westeros. A sellsword fresh from the continent brought tales of the War of the Five Kings, how it had petered out, how the Lannisters still held sway in King's Landing, how the Tyrells had grown in influence. Tyrion listened quietly, swallowing the knot in his throat when he heard mention of Cersei. The sellsword spoke of her cunning, how she maneuvered at court. Tyrion felt a flicker of anger. He remembered too well his sister's hateful glances, her attempts to see him executed FO. He learned more scraps of news from other drifters. That Stannis Baratheon had marched north, that Jon Snow had risen to become Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, that winter loomed. Some spoke of White Walkers in hushed, incredulous whispers, but that was too fantastical for many. Tyrion listened, uncertain what to believe, but vaguely unsettled. Winter was coming, he thought, a phrase he had heard many times from the Stark family. And yet here he was, in the Stepstones, far from the snows and storms. Perhaps that was for the best. Let the lords in the north handle their own business. Tyrion was done with the Game of Thrones. He found himself in a curious position. Comfortable, reasonably secure, his talents appreciated. And yet something gnawed at him, a restlessness he could not entirely banish. On a whim, he began setting aside a portion of his coin, building a small reserve. He told himself that if Jason Pike's situation became too precarious, he would slip away. A man like Pike might eventually overreach, and Tyrion did not plan on going down with him. Then, one summer morning, news arrived that the famous Golden Company had landed in the region, possibly at the behest of a Targaryen claimant, or so the rumors said. Talk spread of a young man calling himself Aegon Targaryen, perhaps a pretender, perhaps a hidden heir, no one was quite sure. Tyrion pricked his ears at the mention of the Golden Company, for he knew their reputation well. The most disciplined sellsword company in the world, founded by exiles, and rumored never to have broken a contract. If they were indeed in the Stepstones, it meant change was in the air. Word on the piers was that the Golden Company sought ships to ferry them west. They might ally with the Stormlands, or they might cut a deal with another faction. Rumors abounded, shifting with each retelling. Some claimed this young Targaryen planned to invade Westeros directly. Others said he was forging ties with Pentos. Tyrion considered the possibilities, though he kept his thoughts to himself around Jason Pike. The old warlord's paranoia spiked whenever talk of large companies or powerful backers surfaced. Days later, a small group from the Golden Company arrived on Ember Isle, requesting a meeting with Pike. A hush fell over the fortress as they disembarked. Men in bright armor, bearing the company's gold sigil, proud and silent. Tyrion stood on the palisade, looking down at them, feeling his heart twinge. Perhaps this was a sign that larger events were creeping back into his life. He recalled the Targaryen name and that chance he had abandoned, the path he had refused to take. Pike greeted them in the main hall of his makeshift fortress. Tyrion was invited to attend as a trusted advisor. The tension in the hall was palpable. Pike's men watched the Golden Company's representatives warily, while the newcomers appeared supremely confident. Their leader, a tall man with piercing gray eyes, introduced himself simply as Lieutenant Strickland. He did not say whether he was related to the company's commander or just bore the same name, and Tyrion did not ask. Strickland's voice was cool, measured. The Golden Company is passing through these islands. We seek safe harbor, provisions, and possibly additional ships if we can acquire them. We are prepared to pay fair coin for cooperation. Pike stroked his beard. And if we refuse to cooperate? Or if we decide to close our harbors to you? Strickland offered a thin smile. I am certain that would be unwise. We do not seek a fight here. The Golden Company has no interest in these islands. We have larger goals. But if hindered, we would respond. And I suspect you would prefer to avoid that. Tyrion studied the Golden Company men with cautious admiration. They wore the trappings of professional sellswords who knew their worth. He wondered if the rumors of a Targaryen connection were true. If so, these men might well be the vanguard of an attempt to retake Westeros. Once, the idea might have filled him with hope. Now, it felt remote. Pike breathed a low growl, but he was not a fool. He glanced at Tyrion, who said quietly, "The Golden Company has a reputation for paying its debts and honoring its contracts. If we trade fairly with them, we profit, and we avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Let them buy the supplies they need." Pike's temper flared in his eyes, but he gave a reluctant nod. He turned back to Strickland. "Very well. You may purchase what you need, so long as we are satisfied with the terms." Strickland inclined his head. "That is all we ask." Later that night, after negotiations concluded, Tyrion was approached by a member of the Golden Company who had overheard Pike calling him by name. The sellsword cornered him near the fortress gate. He was a lanky fellow with an Essosi accent. "You're Tyrion Lannister, aren't you?" he asked in a hushed tone. Tyrion paused, swirling a cup of wine in his hand. "I am Tyrion, yes. Lannister? Hard to say. I doubt my family would care to claim me these days." The sellsword smirked. "Word is you fled King's Landing after killing your father, and that you might be wanted for regicide. Are you not also rumored to have killed King Joffrey?" Tyrion's gut clenched. "Rumors are as cheap as bread crusts. If you want to believe them, you can. Or we can have a pleasant conversation about something else." The man chuckled. "As you like. I only mention it because your name is known to some in our company. Men talk. They say you were once the hand of the king or the regent or some such. That you were cunning in war councils." Tyrion grunted. "I've been called cunning by some. Others would say differently." The sellsword shrugged. "Well, if you tire of these islands, the Golden Company might appreciate a mind like yours. Many of us believe our cause is just restoring a Targaryen to the throne, forging alliances. If you ever wanted to return to Westeros, we might help you do so on more favorable terms. Just something to think about." Tyrion took a slow sip of his wine. That old stirring awakened in him again, the sense that perhaps he was meant for more than rummaging around these islands. But he forced himself to remain calm. "I appreciate the thought," he said at last, "but I've grown comfortable here, if you'll excuse me." He returned to his barracks, though he did not sleep easily. The next few days, the Golden Company loaded up on supplies, negotiated the purchase of a handful of small ships from local merchants, and prepared to depart. Tyrion watched them sail away into the open sea with a blend of relief and longing. He had chosen not to join Daenerys Targaryen, and now a different Targaryen, real or pretender, was on the move. The Game of Thrones was continuing without him. Perhaps that was for the best. Jason Pike resumed his posturing, securing his territory. The fortress expanded, new walls were built, and trade resumed across the straits. Tyrion's tasks multiplied. He found himself mediating disputes between local fishermen and Pike's men, translating for foreign merchants who brought small cargoes of luxuries. He instituted a rudimentary tax system, ensuring that goods passing through Ember Isle paid a levy. The arrangement brought the warlord a modest but steady stream of income. As Pike's coffers swelled, so did Tyrion's wage. He had better wine now and a slightly better bed, though it still squeaked annoyingly at night. It was then that a woman arrived on Ember Isle, a Lyseni courtesan who called herself Selima. She claimed she had fled Lys after a dispute with a powerful patron, and she sought refuge in Pike's growing settlement. Tyrion encountered her in the tavern, where she approached him with a warm smile. Her accent was thick, her hair black and curled, and her eyes a startling shade of green. She sat beside him, close enough that he smelled lilac perfume, an intoxicating fragrance compared to the sweat and fish of the stepstones. "I hear you are the one who runs things here," she said softly, her voice lilting with the Lyseni accent. "Is that true?" Tyrion gave a slight chuckle. I organized the numbers, if that is what you mean. The man who truly runs things is Jason Pike. She smiled a small, knowing smile. But you hold influence. A woman traveling alone needs a friend who is flexible with the rules. He eyed her curiously. You've chosen a strange place to flee, if you are truly in trouble. The Stepstones are not known for their hospitality. She shrugged. Better an uncertain freedom than a certain imprisonment. Besides, I can handle myself. I only wish to live without fear. Tyrion recognized something in her tone. A mixture of desperation and quiet ambition. A part of him sympathized. He had spent a lifetime craving acceptance, overshadowed by scorn and mockery. He sipped his wine. If you're seeking safety, I'm not sure Jason Pike is the best protector. He respects only strength or that which can make him rich. Can you offer either? Salima's gaze flicked downward. I was once a trained companion, taught to please powerful men. But I also learned secrets, how to listen, how to manipulate. Perhaps that has some value. Secrets often do, Tyrion said softly, remembering how knowledge could turn the tide of wars. If you have them, be careful how you share them. Information is a blade that cuts both ways. She lifted her eyes to meet his. I am careful. I wonder if you might be my friend here. Tyrion hesitated. He felt the old wariness creep into his heart. Still, he gave a faint nod. I might, if we can come to an arrangement. For now, let us simply drink in peace. She smiled, and they drank together, exchanging small tidbits about their lives without revealing too much. Over the next weeks, Salima established herself as a fixture in Pike's domain, offering companionship to bored soldiers and, occasionally, gleaning bits of gossip. Tyrion watched her from the sidelines, unsure whether she was truly seeking safety or angling for influence. Perhaps both. In time, Salima began slipping Tyrion little notes about conversations she overheard. Plans among dissatisfied captains, rumors of nearby powers plotting to attack Ember Isle. Tyrion gleaned that she was adept at subtle persuasion, but also that she had no true loyalty to Jason Pike. She was, in her own way, much like Tyrion, a survivor willing to align with whomever would protect her. He found he could not fault her for that. As the fortress grew more entrenched, Tyrion tried to dissuade Pike from launching more aggressive campaigns. The warlord's ambitions had grown with each small victory. He wanted to conquer more islands, to push out rival Sellsword companies. Tyrion reminded him that doing so would stretch their forces thin, and that the Stepstones had always existed in a state of shifting alliances. Pike would be inviting an alliance of his enemies if he grew too dominant. But Pike's hunger for power was not easily quelled. He organized raids on 2 smaller islands, each held by petty lords. At first, these raids were successful, yielding plunder and hostages. Pike strutted around the fortress, bragging of his achievements. Yet the retaliation came swiftly. Allies of those petty lords joined forces, striking Pike's new holdings, burning his outposts. Supply ships were attacked once again. Soon, Pike's proud domain teetered on the brink. Tyrion stayed behind his desk, trying to keep the books balanced and the men paid. He watched as the tension rose, as captains muttered about the wisdom of continuing these fights. He tried to advise Pike on forging alliances, offering deals to those he had attacked. But Pike's temper got the better of him. He refused to negotiate, seeing it as a sign of weakness. One night, Salima found Tyrion pacing in the fortress courtyard, near a guttering torch. She placed a hand on his shoulder. You look uneasy. He let out a humorless laugh. Uneasy is a mild term. Pike is marching us toward disaster, and I'm not sure I want to stick around for the final act. She glanced around cautiously. I've heard rumors that 2 rival captains are combining their fleets to blockade Ember Isle. Soldiers are frightened. Some are thinking of desertion. Tyrion exhaled. They'd be wise to. Pike's men have spirit, but their discipline is lacking compared to the Golden Company. If the blockade is real, trade will halt. Our supplies will dwindle. Pike has no plan for that except to fight. What will you do? She asked softly. Tyrion pressed his lips together, feeling the stirrings of a plan forming in his mind. I suspect I'll leave if it comes to that. I have enough coins saved to buy my passage out of here. I'd rather not die for Pike's vanity. She nodded, a slight tension in her gaze. Will you take me with you? He turned toward her. If I can manage it, yes. But I make no promises. I have a knack for survival, but I'm not entirely selfless. She took his hand, surprising him with her earnestness. I understand, but I'm useful. If there's a way, we can help each other. Tyrion studied her face in the flickering torchlight. He saw no guile in her eyes, only desperation. He squeezed her hand once, briefly. We'll see how things unfold. The blockade rumors proved true. Within a fortnight, a fleet appeared off the coast, ships bearing the sigils of 2 minor lords and the black sails of pirates who had joined them. With the supply routes cut and Pike's outposts under attack, Ember Isle became a fortress under siege. Pike fumed, ordering his men to gather every scrap of provisions. He ignored Tyrion's counsel to attempt negotiations or bribes. Instead, he poured resources into a hasty navy, a ragtag collection of fishing vessels and repurposed pirate sloops. The men were no match for the blockading fleets. In the fortress, the mood grew grim. The captains bickered, and morale slipped. Tyrion still did his best, reminding them that pay could be distributed fairly if they held strong. But fear was more potent than gold. Men deserted under cover of night, slipping onto small boats to try their luck in open waters. Some were caught by the blockading ships and brought back as prisoners or worse. Jason Pike patrolled the fortress walls, barking at the men. He began drinking more heavily, suspicious of treachery at every turn. Tyrion saw the writing on the wall. The warlord's short temper and grand ambitions were leading them toward collapse. One evening, as the clouds gathered overhead and thunder rumbled in the distance, Tyrion decided it was time. He packed what few possessions he had, mostly coins, some clothes, a few personal items. Selima joined him, slipping silently into his quarters. They intended to steal a small rowboat from the cove under the fortress, then make for a neutral port. Their plan was haphazard, but waiting any longer would only increase the risk. The blockade ships might close in fully, or Pike might lash out in paranoia. Tyrion was not willing to gamble his life on Jason Pike's final stand. A sudden commotion in the courtyard interrupted them. Shouts rang out. Tyrion peered out the window and saw a circle of armed men. Jason Pike stood at the center, face flushed with anger, gesturing wildly at a kneeling figure. Even from a distance, Tyrion recognized the kneeling man, Commander Halvar, his old contact. Pike was accusing Halvar of betrayal, of plotting a mutiny. Tyrion's stomach twisted. Pike might well start purging any who questioned him, or any who had grown too close to Tyrion's measured counsel. Tyrion motioned for Selima to stay quiet. They crouched by the window and watched as Pike kicked Halvar, who toppled sideways into the muddy ground. Then Pike raised his sword and, with a snarling cry, brought it down. The flash of steel was abrupt and final. Halvar's blood splattered across the ground, dark and glistening. Selima stifled a gasp, her grip tightening on Tyrion's arm. Pike shouted something about loyalty and dragged Halvar's body away. The men around him looked uneasy, but none dared to challenge him. Tyrion realized that if he did not flee tonight, his own head might soon be on the chopping block. Pike knew how close Tyrion had been with Halvar, and paranoia would only worsen. They waited until the courtyard cleared, then slipped out of Tyrion's quarters under the cover of a gathering storm. Thunder boomed, and fat raindrops began to pelt the fortress walls. Darkness enveloped them. The flickering torches around the perimeter were soon guttering in the downpour. Tyrion led Selima to a narrow staircase carved into the cliffside. There was a hidden cove at the bottom, where a small rowboat was usually moored. Lightning slashed across the sky, illuminating the waves crashing below. The cove was awash in churning water, the tide higher than expected due to the storm. Tyrion cursed under his breath. The rowboat bobbed wildly, tethered to a jut of rock. Selima gripped his arm to steady herself. "We'll be dashed against the rocks," she hissed. Tyrion's mind raced. They had to try. Pike's men might find them at any moment. Another bolt of lightning revealed the rowboat, and Tyrion saw that it was not alone. A second boat lay smashed against the cliff, likely from a previous deserter's failed attempt. They descended carefully, the wind howling, rain stinging their faces. Tyrion's heart pounded. He half expected to hear a shout above, or the whistle of an arrow. But the storm masked their movements. When they reached the water's edge, Tyrion fumbled to untie the rope securing the small craft. Selima climbed in first, gripping the sides until her knuckles whitened. Then Tyrion clambered in, nearly losing his footing as a wave slammed into the cliff. They lurched away from the rocks, rowing with desperate strength. The sea tossed them like a toy. Tyrion's arms burned. He cursed as each wave threatened to overturn the tiny vessel. His breath came in ragged gasps. Rain pelted them and salt spray stung his eyes. Selima clung to the boat, trying to help row, her face contorted with fear. By chance or by luck, they managed to slip away from Ember Isle's jagged coast. Tyrion spared one last glance over his shoulder at the silhouette of the fortress on the cliff, lightning illuminating its walls. It looked like a crumbling monument to vanity, battered by the storm. He felt no sorrow at leaving. Now came the greater challenge, evading the blockade ships. But with the storm raging, perhaps the enemy fleet would not be out in force. Perhaps they would be tucked away in safer waters. Tyrion rowed until his arms trembled, trying to angle toward a route he believed might be unguarded. He had memorized the rough location of each blockade ship from earlier sightings. The swirling darkness made it impossible to see more than a few yards, though occasional bursts of lightning revealed fleeting shapes. By the time the storm subsided into a drizzling rain, they were far from Ember Isle on open water. The wind had carried them south, Tyrion guessed, though he was not certain. Exhaustion weighed on them. Selima slumped in the boat, teeth chattering. Tyrion rummaged for a small flask of stale spirits he had packed, pressed it to her lips, and then took a swig himself. They drifted for hours, resting in silence, the tension gradually seeping from their limbs. Morning found them bobbing in calmer seas, with gray light creeping over the horizon. Tyrion's eyes were gritty from lack of sleep. His throat felt raw, but they were alive, and for that he was grateful. He forced himself to check their modest supplies. Some water, a bit of dried bread, nothing that would last more than a day or two. They needed to find land. Selima roused herself, her hair matted to her face, clothing soaked. She shivered, but when she looked at Tyrion, a flicker of relief crossed her features. "Where to now?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Tyrion sighed. "Away from Pike, that's for certain. I've heard there are smaller ports to the south, beyond the blockade's reach, near Sorrow's Reef. If we're lucky, we might find a fisherman's village or a cove to land." She nodded, her eyes distant. "Anything is better than that fortress." He handed her an oar, and they took turns rowing, their strokes clumsy and weak from exhaustion. The day crept by, the sun hidden behind pale clouds. Tyrion wondered briefly about the Golden Company, about the rumored Targaryen pretender, about the War of the Five Kings, about King's Landing. So many swirling pieces in a grand game. And here he was, a dwarf in a rowboat, fleeing yet another doomed situation. At dusk, they spotted a low shape on the horizon. Tyrion squinted. Land. He exhaled a shaky laugh of relief. They rowed until they could make out the dark line of a shore, rocky but less forbidding than the cliffs of Ember Isle. As they neared, Tyrion glimpsed flickering lights, perhaps a village or campfires. He felt a twinge of both hope and caution. They needed help, but they did not know what dangers might lurk there. Night claimed the sky, and they pulled the boat onto a narrow stretch of beach, half hidden by a curved outcropping of rock. Tyrion collapsed onto the sand, panting. Selima curled up beside him, too spent to speak. The sound of distant voices and the glow of firelight suggested a settlement was not far inland, but they dared not approach in their condition. They slept fitfully on the beach, cold, weary, but grateful to be free of Pike's tyranny. When dawn broke, golden light revealed a small cluster of huts some distance along the coast. Thin columns of smoke rose, and Tyrion guessed it was a fishing community. He sat up, wiped sand from his face, and gently shook Selima awake. "We'd best see if they're friendly," he murmured. They trudged across the sand, forging a plan. They would pose as travelers whose ship had been sunk in the storm, a partial truth, if not the whole story. With luck, the villagers would offer them some hospitality, or at least a hot meal. Tyrion's coin purse remained intact. Though he had lost some money in the boat, enough remained to buy a measure of goodwill. A pair of fishermen spotted them and approached warily. Tyrion raised both hands in a sign of peace, explaining their plight. His accent and Selima's Lysini features drew curious glances, but eventually the fishermen beckoned them closer. They led Tyrion and Selima to a modest hut where an old woman stirred a pot of fish stew. The aroma was heavenly to Tyrion's starved senses. He and Selima accepted bowls of the stew, devouring it despite the fishy odor. Warmth spread through their bellies. The village elder, a man with a wispy beard, came to question them. Tyrion offered a carefully constructed story, omitting any mention of Jason Pike or the fortress. He explained that they were heading south, seeking new opportunities, and that the storm had wrecked their vessel. The elder frowned, but did not press too hard. It seemed these villagers cared little for grand politics, focusing on survival in the rough environs of the Stepstones. For several days, Tyrion and Selima stayed there, slowly regaining their strength. Tyrion paid for their lodging with a bit of coin and some small tasks, helping with ledgers for the fishermen who occasionally sold their catch to passing ships. The old woman seemed amused by the dwarf's eagerness to repay them with anything other than manual labor. Selima occasionally helped with gathering herbs or preparing meals, using her charm to put the villagers at ease. In the quiet moments, as gulls wheeled overhead and the tides rolled in, Tyrion felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time in his life, he was not embroiled in schemes or battles. He was merely a survivor, resting in a humble village. The notion was both comforting and unsettling. He would not be content to remain here forever, but for now he felt a measure of peace. One afternoon, as Tyrion stood on the beach, staring at the horizon, Selima approached. She had woven sea grass into her dark hair, and despite the hardships, there was a liveliness in her eyes. "We can't stay here indefinitely," she said softly. Tyrion nodded. Agreed. But where to go next? The Stepstones are full of petty tyrants like Pike, and the blockade might still hold in the north. Selima hesitated, then spoke. "I overheard a rumor. A fisherman said a galley from Dorne sometimes passes this route on its way to trade with the free cities. If we could book passage on it, we could reach either Dorne or possibly Volantis." Tyrion considered this. Dorne was technically part of Westeros, though it had a history of independence. Volantis was across the sea in Essos, where the sprawl of the free cities stretched. He thought of Daenerys Targaryen once more, of Meereen and the conquests he had deliberately avoided. Now, with the mention of Volantis, he felt a faint pull. The eastern cities were closer to the rumored Targaryen queen, should she still be there. But was that a path he wanted to tread? He had refused to follow Varys before, opting for this uncertain life instead. And yet, an ember of curiosity still lingered in his heart. He exhaled. "We'll see if the galley arrives. I have enough coin to buy our passage, I think. Perhaps Dorne is safer. But the east, I don't know if I'm ready for that." Selima shrugged, letting the breeze ruffle her hair. "One step at a time. We just need to get away from here, to somewhere with more opportunity." They lingered, waiting for that galley, forging a fragile existence among the fishermen. But fate, as always, had other plans. A battered cog flying no flag came into the cove one morning, seeking refuge. Tyrion recognized it as one of Jason Pike's old ships, evidently run by deserters who had broken away. The fishermen were alarmed, unsure whether to let the crew land. Eventually, the vessel dropped anchor, and a handful of rough-looking men rowed ashore. Tyrion and Selima kept their distance, but it didn't take long for word to spread that a dwarf and a Lysini woman had been seen in the village. Suspicious glances were cast. The men from the ship asked questions about the fortress and the blockade. Tyrion suspected they might be planning to plunder the village or press the locals for supplies. The tension rose. Fearing confrontation, Tyrion prepared to slip away in the night. But it was too late. One of the men recognized Tyrion from Ember Isle. Perhaps they had crossed paths in the fortress courtyard. The deserter confronted him on the beach at dusk. Tyrion had no weapon, save a small dagger at his belt. The man brandished a sword, eyes wild. "I know you," he hissed. "You're the dwarf who served Pike. Why are you here? Did Pike send you to track us?" Tyrion held up his hands. "I serve Pike no longer. We fled before everything fell apart." The man spat. "Prove it. Hand over your coin, or I'll carve the truth out of you." Tyrion's mind raced. Another step in this endless chain of violence. He could not best this man in a fair fight. He glanced around, but there were no villagers in sight. Selima lingered a few yards away, fear flashing in her eyes. Tyrion summoned his courage. "Perhaps we can negotiate. There's no need for bloodshed. I have some coin, yes, but if you kill me, you'll gain little, and you'll bring the wrath of the village upon you. These fishermen may not look like much, but they can muster quickly." The man sneered. "I doubt that. Besides, I could use a ransom. Maybe someone will pay for your head." Tyrion felt a flash of desperation. This was the kind of brute he had navigated around his entire life, one who valued force over reason. But Tyrion still had his wits. He reached for the coin purse at his belt. "If coin is what you want, you can have it. Just let me and the girl go. We'll vanish." Selima took a step forward. "You don't want to do this," she said softly, her voice lilting. "We left Pike, we have no part in his wars. Let us be." The man's eyes lingered on her, lust or greed flickering. "I think I'll keep her, too. Bet I can get a good price." Tyrion's heart hammered. He needed to do something quickly. He waited until the man's attention drifted to Selima. Then, in a sudden motion, Tyrion drew his dagger and lunged. He was no warrior, but he knew the element of surprise. The blade found the man's thigh, slicing deep. The man bellowed, swinging his sword wildly. Tyrion ducked, but not fast enough. He felt the sting of steel across his shoulder. Pain flared. Selima seized a rock and struck the man on the head. He staggered, howling in pain, and Tyrion slashed again, opening a gash in the man's arm. Blood spattered the sand. The deserter stumbled, cursing them both, then turned to flee, leaving a trail of red droplets. Likely he realized the fight wasn't worth it. Tyrion collapsed to his knees, panting, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped through his fingers. Selima knelt beside him, face pale. "We have to get out of here," he gasped. "That man will tell his fellows. They might come after us." She nodded, voice trembling. "We'll find a boat. Anything that floats." Mustering their courage and ignoring the pain, they made their way to the village docks. Alarm had already spread. The deserters' wounds had roused the other men. But the fishermen recognized Tyrion and Selima as allies, and a few offered them sympathy. Tyrion pressed what remained of his coin into the village elder's hands. "We need a small boat," he whispered, his shoulder throbbing. "Or safe passage on a trading ship. Anything." The elder, after seeing Tyrion's wound, took pity. He gestured to a tiny skiff moored in the shallows. "Take it, but hurry, and may the gods protect you." Lighting a torch to see in the darkening sky, Tyrion and Selima hurried down the dock. Tyrion's shoulder burned with each movement, but he pressed on. The deserters' compatriots might descend on them at any moment. They clambered into the skiff, pushing off from the shore. Two fishermen helped shove them into the deeper water. Selima took the oar, while Tyrion, groaning in pain, tried to bandage his shoulder with a strip of cloth. They rowed into the night, uncertain of their direction. Clouds shrouded the stars. Tyrion fought waves of dizziness from blood loss. Selima gripped the oar, panic in her eyes, but she persisted. If they could put enough distance between themselves and the shore, perhaps they would find safety somewhere. As the hours wore on, Tyrion drifted in and out of consciousness. He clutched the side of the skiff, breath ragged. Memories flitted through his mind. King's Landing, his father's face, Shae's betrayal, Varys' offer, the bitterness of refusing the path toward Daenerys Targaryen. He wondered if it would have been better to face the unknown in Meereen rather than roam from one danger to the next. But regret served him little now. Dawn revealed a sullen sky and calm seas. Selima had dozed in the boat, head bowed. Tyrion's shoulder throbbed under the rough bandage. He felt feverish, though the bleeding seemed to have lessened. He blinked the crust from his eyes, scanning the horizon. Nothing but endless water. "We have to keep going," he rasped, rousing Selima. She nodded, took up the oar again. "Where?" she asked, voice hoarse. "South," Tyrion managed. "We follow the sun if we must, or wait for any passing vessel." Their water supply was all but gone, and they had precious little food. Tyrion knew they could not last long. Despite the pain, he attempted to help row, though his strength was meager. The hours stretched. Hunger gnawed at them. Selima offered encouraging words, but they both knew how dire the situation was. They took shifts rowing and resting, hoping to find a sail on the horizon. Finally, late in the day, a shape appeared. A merchant ship, or so it seemed. Tyrion and Selima mustered what little energy they had to wave and shout. The ship began to turn toward them. Relief mingled with apprehension. Were these friend or foe? They had no choice but to hope. As the vessel drew closer, Tyrion recognized the style of the hull. It resembled a Carthene design, though he could not be certain. Rough-faced sailors leaned over the rail, calling out in a foreign tongue. Selima attempted to respond in Valyrian, and eventually a rope was tossed down. They tied it to the skiff, and a pair of sailors hauled them aboard. Collapsed on the deck, Tyrion felt cool water pressed to his lips. He drank gratefully, ignoring the brine and the stench of fish. Selima clung to his side, her face etched with exhaustion. A tall man with an intricately braided beard stood over them, likely the captain. He spoke to Selima in rapid Valyrian. She translated haltingly for Tyrion's benefit. "He wants to know who we are and why we're adrift at sea." Tyrion mustered a weak chuckle. "Tell him we're travelers who ran afoul of pirates," which, in a sense, was true enough. The captain eyed them suspiciously, then barked an order. A couple of sailors hoisted Tyrion upright and carried him to a cramped cabin. Selima followed, stumbling. Inside, the captain gestured at Tyrion's shoulder wound, speaking in a concerned tone. Selima nodded, turning to Tyrion. "He says they have a healer on board. They'll treat you if you pay." Tyrion let out a breath. "I'll pay what I can. Just keep me alive." The next hours blurred. A woman with deft hands cleaned and stitched Tyrion's wound, applying a pungent salve that burned like wildfire. He bit down on a cloth, trying not to cry out. Selima helped hold him still. The fever flared, and he drifted into half-consciousness, haunted by phantoms of the past. He dreamt of King's Landing, of Tywin's chamber, of Varys' offer to go to Daenerys. He dreamt of dragons overhead, roaring flames. When he awoke, the cabin was dimly lit by a single lantern. His shoulder throbbed, but the sharp agony had receded. He blinked, disoriented, then saw Selima dozing on the floor, a blanket draped over her. The ship rocked gently. Tyrion exhaled, feeling his lips crack. He asked in a hoarse whisper for water. A sailor standing watch outside the door brought a small cup. Tyrion drank. His thoughts slowly coalesced. He was on a merchant ship, likely heading east or south. If he survived this ordeal, what would he do next? The question weighed on him. He had turned away from Westeros, turned away from the notion of helping a Targaryen reclaim the Iron Throne. Yet the world seemed determined to thrust him into chaos no matter what path he chose. Was there truly any escape from the power games of great houses, from the shadow of his family name? Perhaps not. But for now he was alive, battered but unbroken. Selima stirred and rose to sit by his side, brushing damp hair from his forehead. He gave her a faint smile, appreciating her concern. In the passing days, Tyrion's wound improved under the healer's watchful eye. The captain demanded payment, and Tyrion offered what little coin he still had, hoping it would be enough. Selima chipped in with a small ring she had hidden on her person. The transaction seemed to satisfy the captain. He allowed them to remain aboard as they sailed toward a distant port. The name of that port, Selima discovered, was Lys, ironically the very city she had fled. But the captain promised they would only stop briefly to trade, then continue on to Volantis. Tyrion mulled his options. Lys might not be safe for Selima, but Volantis was a large city where they could lose themselves and find new opportunities. Perhaps from Volantis they could travel anywhere, north to Pentos, west to Myr, or even deeper into Essos. Each day that brought them closer to Lys also brought more rumors among the sailors. Some spoke of a queen across the sea who commanded dragons and armies, who broke chains and laid waste to those who opposed her. Tyrion listened in silence, suspecting they meant Daenerys Targaryen. He felt a pang of something between longing and dread. He had once considered being part of that grand cause. Now he floated on the outskirts of the world, a wounded dwarf with no clear path. Yet in that limbo he felt a small spark of hope. He had survived the Stepstones and Jason Pike. Perhaps he could survive anything. And perhaps, in the great sprawl of Essos, he would stumble upon a purpose worth embracing. He was no one's son, no one's brother, no one's counselor now. He was free in a sense, though freedom came with its share of dangers. Selima was dozing in a corner, lulled by the steady roll of the sea. Tyrion watched her, thinking of the many lost souls who drifted across the world. Maybe, just maybe, they would find a place to call their own. Or perhaps they would continue wandering, forever on the run from kings and queens, from tyrants and pirates. Either way, Tyrion had learned that life seldom gave him what he expected. If he were wise, he would prepare for anything. He closed his eyes and let the sound of the waves wash over him. The journey continued, and he would face it as he always had. One step at a time, one clever word at a time, with a flask of wine in hand, if possible. Somewhere far away, Daenerys Targaryen might be conquering cities and forging alliances that would shape the fate of empires. Somewhere else, Cersei might be plotting in King's Landing, weaving a web of intrigue. But Tyrion was out here, on a merchant ship, forging his own uncertain path. And though part of him wondered what might have been if he had joined the Dragon Queen, another part of him felt, for the first time, the faint stirrings of genuine freedom. He drifted into a light sleep, lulled by the creaking timbers and the hum of the sailors' voices above. In his mind's eye, he saw flickers of dragons soaring across a red sky, wings outstretched. Then the image faded, replaced by a vision of open seas and endless horizons. He might never sit on a council shaping the fate of kingdoms. He might never again see the halls of the Red Keep. But he could, at last, choose his own direction, free from the Lannister legacy, free from the illusions of power he once chased. In the midst of all his regrets, Tyrion found a sliver of solace in that uncertain future. The sea rocked gently, the lantern flickered, and the imp, who had once been a key player in the Wars of Kings, allowed himself to rest, unburdened by oaths, unclaimed by any queen. And if there was a faint ache in his heart, a lingering question of what might have been, he buried it deep, letting the hush of the sea cradle him into uneasy dreams of half-remembered hopes.